Okay, we should be live. This is consensus layer call ACDC 108, issue 771 on the PM repo. We're starting at number 3 today, apparently, says the markdown. Deneb, then some general stuff discussions, and then some time for any other discussion points people have. Let's see. So last call, both in the execution layer call and the consensus layer call, we're kind of like trying to shuffle towards like a final feature set for Deneb. Seems like we're getting close on this end. So a couple of updates and a couple of discussion points. Alex is not on the call today, but 4788 is CFI'd on the execution layer. There's a lot CFI'd, so it's not 100% clear exactly what's going to make it into the final list. But I think we will be moving forward with the 4788 building into the Deneb fork, given that signal. So we'll have testing and other things like that. It is on the consensus layer on the minor range, but we'll work on getting that built into the fork and released relatively soon. Let's see, Sooks had a summary. Let me scan real quick to see if there's any relevant stuff. Okay, yeah, so there's a little bit of discussion on the execution layer, how that actually shows up, but he also comments that it's pretty straightforward with this layer. So any questions or comments on that, or on the process, or how things are moving forward here? Great. Okay. The other item that 2 weeks ago there was general consensus on this call, this is not a cross-layer feature to get into Deneb, is that slash validators cannot be proposers, which is a minor change to the proposer shuffling function. We were able to greatly reduce the diff with like a slightly different place and where this was being called. That is in that PR 3175. Mikhail did open up a corresponding EIP that's still like in a pretty early draft status, but it now has a number 6987. Mikhail, do you have any other comments on this one?
Nope. Yeah, the PR. I think that we should settle this down into the features directory to make it a proper like change to the CL. Mentioned this in the EIP as well. Yeah, and as you mentioned, the footprint, the diff of the changes has been reduced, which is great. It's great suggestion on the way to do it. Testing is also kind of ready, so it's just about like more specking, more shaping the spec in a better way. Now, what's left to my observation?
Sounds good. Both on this and 4788 will keep things moving such that it gets into the Deneb full fork build and tests soon. Any questions on these two items? Okay, great. There's an open PR that's had some active discussion. This is 3338 on the consensus specs repo. Essentially, techniques for potentially allowing additional slack in the blob constants on the consensus layer such that you don't have to do a cross-layer fork when updating the gas limit on the execution layer. Does anybody want to give an update on the status of this conversation? It's been a lot of back and forth.
Yeah, I can give a little bit of update.
Great.
So the original proposal was that, okay, we keep max blobs per block a little higher, on the execution API so that EL clients can basically increase their data gas independently and henceforth increase the throughput of the blobs. So basically, over the conversation, it was discussed that, putting it to a much higher bound like 1024 was not a good idea. So maybe 16 blobs per block was okay. Even over there, we have some discussion going on. But one other thing that has come out on it is that we should have another variable like max commitments per block, which basically, and keep it to a high level like 1024, which basically means that the Merkle proofs that are generated even now would be valid to a point when, for example, we kick up the blobs per block to a high number in sharding. So basically inside the block, we have the list of commitments based upon this high value, but we still basically have 4 or 16 blobs right now that the CL layer can handle. And depending upon what we feel like, maybe we want to kick up the current max blobs to 16. That is an independent question from max commitments per block. So these are the two discussion points being discussed in that PR.
Okay, so we get Jacek proposed an additional variable that gives us the shape of the block, shape of the Merkle tree with respect to the block that would be forward compatible. And then an additional constant to bound the actual amount that we're willing to accept currently. And that could be synonymous with the value that's in the execution layer, or that could have some growth baked in, like up to 16, up to 2 megabytes, if we wanted to give a little bit of elasticity to the execution layer without the consensus layer needing a fork. That's where we're at.
Yep.
Okay. Great, thank you. Yeah, I just want to bring this to people's attention. This is something that has had active discussion and might have tiny changes with respect to constants and how they're configured. Are there other discussion points on this or questions on this? Otherwise, if you are interested in this topic, please jump into this PR. I think this is one of those minor details, but one that we should get ironed out maybe by like the next call, and maybe the next release that might include some of these other minor features that are going to get in. Okay. Okay, check it out. 3338. Marius, can you mute?
I'm mute.
Oh, it's somebody else. All right. Great. So those are our general Deneb discussion points. Are there any other items that we want to discuss with respect to Deneb? Any ongoing issues or any updates with the test nets? Anything? DevNet.
Basically, this morning when Mario started we saw some problems unfold. Aragon is crashing with some very massive print statements, and Nethermind nodes were unable to propose blocks. We had a short period of on finalization also.
And this was a transaction fuzzer, you said?
It was, but it was not working correctly as far as I understood.
Yeah, so I have no idea what I did. I basically just started the fuzzer, and because I was not using my own node, I don't know how many transactions I sent. I don't know what transactions I sent, and I'm also not sure if this is actually me causing chaos. I'm going to set up I'm going to set up my own node so I can better see what's happening and what I'm actually doing, what my code is actually doing. And so yeah, it's very fuzzy at the moment, but I'm glad that there have been some issues uncovered already.
Yeah. Are you okay, Marius?
Kind of, but yeah,
Okay,
thanks.
Great. Okay, cool. That's exciting. Good to see that stuff now rather than later. Okay. Any other on the devnet?
Not right now. No.
Okay. Tim did threaten to hijack a portion of this call to talk about SSZ. Tim, do you want to give a status update or any time on that?
Sure. So basically the status with SSZ and 4844 is that as I think the EL client teams have started to implement this, there's been questions around is the amount of SSZ we're introducing with 4844 actually helpful to getting us towards full SSZ on the EL? And if it isn't, then does introducing sort of partial SSZ now and not being able to fully leverage it actually make things worse than simply sticking with RLP to encode the 4844 type 3 transactions? And I know that Light Client, Roberto and Ethan have been discussing this a lot on the Discord. So I don't know if either of them have an update.
Yeah, so if we're right now, SSZ kind of like flat hash is kind of in the worst of both worlds. Like we add a new dependency and don't really make it look like it's going to look in the future. So then the question becomes, try to make it look like it looks in the future or move to RLP to not be in this unhappy medium.
Right, and I think Ethan had changed his EIP 6493, I believe, based on part of that feedback. But yeah, Matt, I saw you came off mute. I know you had some feedback on
please.
it. So
I was just gonna say, I think this is one of those things where it's hard to make it look like what we think it should look in the future without having an extremely clear idea of what the future should / is going to look like. And I think in the past we've done this thing where we think we're being forward compatible with the world, but then the way we understand the world / the world changes a lot in the 1 to 3 or 4 years it takes to complete the thing. So it's just really hard for us to actually put SSD here in a way that we know is going to be forward compatible. And I think like the reality is that it's almost certain that we'll either constrain the design space in the future or we just have to straight up change what we choose today.
And I will make a quick comment that this does primarily solely affect the execution layer. So we don't have kind of the full consensus of people that might be interested in making discussions. This is a bit more of a status update, but we can have more discussion if anyone has additional points.
actually, one thing I'd be curious to understand better, Xiaowei, you made a comment in the chat about how this would affect the CL specs if we move completely to RLP. Do you mind maybe just sharing a bit more on that?
Yeah, so in the Deneb 444 spec, we have a function to access the block version hashes. So right now it's SSZ, and we use the SSZ logic to pass the bytes into and to found the version hashes. So that function has to be changed if we use the full RLP transaction. I will share the link.
I had one
Right.
idea. I'm not sure if this is possible, but if we're able to have the version blob hashes of the transaction in 2 places whenever it's being propagated among CLs, where we have it represented in the RLP transaction, and then we have it outside of the RLP transaction in a structure that the CL can understand. And what we could do is then we could verify the blobs and all the information against these version hashes that are outside the RLP transaction. Once all the checks are complete, we give the RLP transactions and those hashes to the execution layer over the engine API. And the first thing that the execution layer does is it just checks to see if the hashes in the RLP transaction match the hashes that were provided outside of the RLP transaction. That way you don't actually need to do any kind of RLP work on the CL.
And an upgrade to the encoding would be opaque to the CL at that point. Or transparent, wherever the word that is meaningful there, but we wouldn't have to do anything.
Yeah, it's slightly more complicated, but it seems like that would allow you to avoid having any RLP on the CL.
With regards to the forwards compatibility argument, I mean, if two things. First of all, like with RLP, we're definitely not forwards compatible. And the second thing is that SSZ kind of brings features today already, right? You can build nice Merkle proofs over them and stuff like this. So it's not like
Not in the way that we're using it now. We're only serializing the SSD.
Yeah, it's a flat.
So
hash rate.
there's no hash tree root.
I mean, why are we doing that anyway? Why
That's a
aren't we
good question.
just using the hash tree root? Like the arguments for that seem rather weak to me.
I mean, we
yeah,
can
I
use
th-
the
I think
hash tree root. I think there's just like more like strange things that start end up happening. Like if we use the hash tree root, then like what goes into the Merkle Patricia trie? Is it the type transaction prefix with the hash tree root? Is it the SSD root? Like the transaction hash comes out of the fact that it's like the hash of the transaction that goes into the Merkle Patricia trie. And so we start opening the box of all of these like weird things that we have to figure out.
And the why it's a flat hash, I think, if I remember correctly, it was an attempt to get SSD in there in a very minimal way. But again, in retrospect, or maybe it should have been clear at the time, it's kind of the worst of both worlds. We can continue to discuss this. I think it's maybe more appropriate that now we've just kind of highlighted that this issue exists and to engage the conversation between now and leading up into the execution layer call next week, where we'll have more of the relevant parties. Any other comments on this one today?
Yeah, hopefully we can resolve this in the next week or so. It does feel like on the EL side, it's like the biggest spec issue with regards to 444.
So one thing that I like that kind of like we have to change the transaction types at some point anyway, and I think it would be better to have like them all RLP until that point, and then figure out something where we can convert all of them. And one thing that like if we were to go this route of having the blob transactions in our RLP, one thing that I would really like us to do is to create this conception that this transaction type will not be there forever, and we are going to drop it at some point in favor of the full SSC blob transaction type. Once we have the SSC transaction root. And so because we suspect only rollups are going to use this transaction type, it will most likely see very little usage. And so I would like to, if we go this route of having it RLP, I would like to state from the beginning that this is like a temporary solution, and we are going to drop this transaction type fully at some point.
essentially a deprecation notice at the creation.
Yes. Well, we are going to, like, this is
Yeah,
the
yeah.
thing, right? This transaction type will only live for a very limited amount of time. Either way, like if we do the SSC stuff or if we do the RP stuff, once we go to like the full SSC transaction route, this transaction type will be changed anyway. So let's, in my opinion, it would be way easier to make it as close to the current transaction types that we have. So we don't have to have another like another
Dependency.
special case
Yeah.
when we do the transition to full SSC.
I have a question. When we plan on for any transaction type that exists, if we're going to migrate from RLP to SSE, would that be actually the deprecation of a transaction type fully, or a mutation of the transaction types? You know, so we take type 1 and then kill it and make type 4, or would type 1 mutate? Is there this might not be specified. I realize I haven't thought of the answer before.
So we, like with the other transaction types, we don't want to fully deprecate them because we still want to allow for this use case that you signed a transaction at some point in the past, and this transaction should still be valid. But
so it'd be
if
the
we
creation of new types.
yes, or maybe we can get rid of them if we provide, for example, a precompile that you can send this transaction to that then executes the transaction for you, something like this. But
got it.
Yeah, there are workarounds around it. But yeah, that's the basic idea.
Thank you. Okay, I propose that this active conversation continues the next week, and we get all the relevant parties on the execution layer discussed in 1 week's time. Thank you. Other Deneb related discussion points for today? Okay, great. We have a number of items in the specification not related to Deneb that we'll go through now. Just a heads up, the Attestation revamp that's been spearheaded by Age, that was discussed 2 weeks ago, will be merged soon after this call, and we'll make it into a release. This is backwards compatible. This does not include the down scoring, so that people can roll it out over time, and we would add the option for down scoring at a hard fork in the future. Any final points on that? Cool. Thank you, Age, and others that have kept this one moving. Okay, is Michael Sproul on the call? Oh, I don't think so. Michael Sproul brought up the Beacon APIs 317. This is add broadcast validation to block publishing. This is essentially, I think we've discussed this. Now there is a PR. This essentially allows for, let's see, for relays to do a full verification before broadcast in light of the unbundling attacks. This helps prevent relays from having to use a forked version of a client, which would help improve client diversity for this use case. I believe there's not been much contention around this, but open it up for discussion now if you have discussion points. Otherwise, please take a look at this PR, and we will probably aim to get it ironed out and merged relatively soon. Any thoughts here?
So we have some thoughts, right? So let's just take a step back on why we are doing this, right? Because the first thing is that having client fork is not ideal, right? Because now Prism has its own fork, Lighthouse has its own fork. And then the second thing is that fully importing the block is not ideal either, because currently we broadcast and we fully import the block. By fully import, I mean you also do execution check, you import the block to the DB, and then you import the state to DB, and that's pretty slow. And then the whole idea is the relayer wants this out as fast as possible. So we found out that, hey, we can actually skip all those steps. We can just verify the consensus side only. And then it turns out we were able to reduce like 80% of the latency by doing that. And therefore, it does make the builder and the relayer very happy, right? And then, but the downside with this is that we're kind of like working with the relayer versus like working on Inshun PBS first, because now like it kind of becomes this whack and war game that we're just like keep adding this feature to support MVB boost or PBS that's out of band. And that's probably the biggest concern here, for example, because now if they want some sort of like equivocation check to check for slashing, and then we probably have to provide that, blah blah blah. So that is the another angle to it. So from our end, we're pretty torn because we can be like, yeah, this is nice to have, but at the same time, we kind of like we're slightly worried that we may be moving away from just doing Inshun PBS. But then I can see the argument of having both, working on both at the same time. So yeah, this is just some 2 cents from our side.
Got it. Thanks, Terrence. Yeah, I guess the way I view those arguments is like we live in a world where MEV boost exists, and we could see some degeneracies in client diversity and usage and other things if there are not some faculties to make it work appropriately. But I definitely sympathize with the other argument. Yeah, it seems like age on Lighthouse side kind of agrees with the issues at hand as well. Okay, yeah, I guess have some discussions with your team to make some sort of opinion about whether this should or should not go in, and whether this path in general should or should not continue to be supported. And please bring any comments you have to PR 317 on the Beacon APIs, so we can continue to have this conversation. Any other points on this one? And thanks, Michael Sproul, for getting the PR up. Okay, Mikhail, you have an open PR on the consensus specs. Send store.finalized block hash to EL. Can you give us an update on this one?
Yeah, this is a pretty old PR, and basically it states that CL client must use must read the finalized block hash from the store instead of to specify this explicit statement saves us from the case where the head state might be used to read this block hash while sending to EL client, which in some very edge cases can lead to finalized block hash being like reverted back into the block history, which would cause some potentially cause some UX issues. And apparently all CL clients already follows this logic. So there is an intention to finish the work on this PR. And I would like to just bring it for client dev's attention. If there are any objections, please raise them in the PR. And that's basically it. So the idea is to probably work on the test, if it is possible, with the current testing framework that we have to test this particular thing. And get it merged. in the coming weeks.
Yeah, thank you, Miko.
That's pretty much it.
Any comments on this one? And I think there's maybe one or two people that are unmuted, and I'm having trouble muting them. So if you can, please mute yourself. Thanks. Okay. There's one other Deneb item that I forgot to bring up. There is not a spec for this already, but in process attestation for the security proofs around the fork choice in relation to some of the recent patches, and for the, I think, very exciting confirmation rule that is an ETH research post right now. There needs to be a slight one-line modification to process attestation. Right now, there's kind of this rolling 32 slot window for a given attestation, for a given slot to get in. The modification would be to, rather than for the previous and the current epoch, or for N and N+1, where the attestation's from N, it has just a rolling 32 slot window that it can be included. The modification would be, if it's from epoch N, it could be included up to the entirety, or the entirety of epoch N+1. This modification helps with the security proofs and helps with the confirmation rule. So that is a one-line change. We're going to get a spec up for soon. This is probably, you know, the addition of a few tests and modification of a few tests on our end. So very small on the consensus spec. It's security related, so I think it should be expedited, but I will open it up for conversation if anybody has any discussion points today. And then by the next call, we'll have a spec up for further discussion.
What about gossip? There, we limit by the same 32 slots, if I remember it right.
Yeah, I'll have to take a look at that, but you're right. We need to probably make sure those are under the same conditionals.
And in the Telegram, we also discussed about rewards. Are there also a discussion point about making them valuable when including in the block?
Do you have particular details? Is there essentially like a degradation of rewards prior to the epoch that would make them be ignored?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, at some point those attestation actually become worthless. And since we filter out attestation that are worthless in the beginning, so we are not going to select them when we produce blocks. So I'm guessing if there are impacts also on this area to
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Ben, you have, I think, the graph of degradation of value of attestation more at the forefront of your head. Can you explain where we're at?
Yeah, so correct. Targets expires after 32 slots. So as Enrico said, the attestation becomes valueless, actually penalized after 32 slots is equivalent to missing it.
Gotcha. Okay, then we'll open that up as well when we're taking a look at this. I'm playing with the P2P real quick. Yeah, okay. It also has the 32 slot bound on the attestation propagation slot range. So yeah, age, not one line. Nonetheless, we'll get this back and try to get a kind of complete view of the necessary changes here. It's a pretty important security improvement, so hopefully we can figure out a simple path forward. Any further comments on this one? Great, thank you. Any other discussion points for today? Great. Okay, thank you, everyone. Take care. Talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Yes.